Hi, everybody. My name is Shai, and I'm very excited to chat today about tips for managing hardware and software as BMs on behalf of Waymo and hosted by the Product School. Thank you so much for joining this. Topic of managing hardware and software together is very close to my heart. And usually I would love to hear your comments and questions and talk about a bit about your experience. Um, so even though this is not an interactive talk, please keep notes and definitely reach out offline and continue this conversation offline. Very excited to hear what other experiences were from other folks. So let's kick it off. Like I said, my name is Shai, and I'm a product manager at Waymo. We broadly have two major products at Waymo. We have the taxi business and the trucking business, also called as Waymo Via, and I am part of the trucking product team. So a lot of examples in my experience will kind of talk to that, although in some occasions I also mention examples from the taxi business. And so I wanted to talk about my background a bit. And before we talk specifically about Waymo, let's talk about kind of a few steps in my career. And throughout my career, I had the opportunity to work for companies that were either software first or hardware first. And this is a very natural tendency for a company. So even though maybe a company is producing or integrating hardware as part of their products, they are many times leaning towards one or the other as what they care for more. And many of you are probably working for tech companies and can think, where on that spectrum is your common company ranked? And it's interesting to notice that, because once you understand that, it might surface opportunities or certain culture, or maybe even help formulate your next think big idea, because it might be kind of thinking from the angle of what you're usually not doing or what opportunities might lay within your company and your space. Specifically, my experience started at Intel, where Intel is a hardware first company. Really, hardware is the bread and butter of what Intel does, and software was almost sometimes an afterthought. Afterwards, I moved to Snap Inc., where it's an social app. And so from a software perspective, that was kind of what brought the revenue, and definitely hardware took more of the back seat. From there, I moved to Amazon, and Amazon really depends on which team you're in. And I had the privilege to work in different teams at Amazon. And Amazon, the Prime Video team, for example, where I started, was very software based. Really, content even was actually more important, and then software, less the hardware components, of course. From there, when I moved to Lab 126 and focused on Alexa, much more hardware focused, although software wasn't, it was more in the middle spectrum kind of thing. And it was interesting that even though each of those companies were ranked differently on the spectrum, a lot of what I'm going to talk about definitely applies regardless of where your company is on the spectrum. And it's interesting to see how many of the tips I'll mention are very valid for each one of those companies. And after spending time in those companies, I actually joined Waymo, which was the first time I actually saw that hardware and software are equally important. It was a pretty unique experience for me. So like I said, I'm part of the trucking side of the business. And from the trucking perspective, we care a lot about hardware and care a lot about software. And we set both of them together. Only both of them together will create recipe to win. So for example, you see on the truck illustration here, Waymo manufactures or integrates certain hardware components. The entire sensor suite you see on the truck here is Waymo specific and unique. And we have a lot of thinking that comes into that to create the best hardware platform there is. The base vehicle components such as steering and braking are also uniquely made in collaboration with our partners. Of course, there's a very specifically designed for this application onboard computer that helps us run all the applications. So that's on the hardware side. And on the software side, we have unique software running all the ML software that we need, state of the art technology, from the perception stack to the planner being the kind of part of the stack that had to make decisions, and the part of the stack motion control that has to control everything on board. Those are really important components. And like I said, only hardware and software together will create the best driver. And that's what we internalized at Waymo. And that was really interesting to see. And again, even in a company like that, where software and hardware are equally important, there's a lot of special skills a product manager needs to have in order to manage such a product. So in this talk, we are going to touch on the following takeaways. So one, we're going to talk a bit about how to leverage both hardware and software skill sets and to solve problems in your organization, how to think like your hardware and software colleagues to make better product decisions, and then better best practices for aligning a vision and a roadmap. All those are really important points, and really things that I hope you can take from this and tactically implement in your company from tomorrow. Starting tomorrow. There's of course many other things, but we have uh, very limited time, and I'm again very excited to hear other opinions and perspective offline. So let's move to the gist of it. So for those who maybe are not exactly working on hardware products or software and hardware together, might not understand why hardware and software are so different. And so really, it's everything lies in the cultural differences that are based on a structure or difference. So structure really drives certain behavior, and the structure or the limitations that each one of those disciplines have influences a different culture, a different mindset, and that eventually creates a gap. So let's talk about it a bit about those differences. So if you talk with a hardware engineer and you ask a hardware engineer what's going to happen in 2 years from now, they probably know. They're probably all working on this right now. And that's kind of the length of where they're looking at, which is maybe very exciting for some of us. If you ask a software engineer what you're going to do in 2 years from now, they're not even sure that they know what's going to happen in a month from now. So they're probably going to laugh. So there's definitely differences in the roadmap timeline and the way each of those disciplines think. Very similarly, there's a difference of the release cadence. A software team can move very fast and break things, like they like to say. A hardware team cannot move that fast. It takes time to design a really good piece of hardware, and the release cadence is usually years. I would say even in consumer electronics, it probably takes between 12 to 18 months to actually produce a product from start to finish. And if it's really unique and renovate and revolutionary, it probably takes much more than that. And in terms of cost, of course, hardware, very costly. There's actually physical matter here that you have to produce, silicon, circuits, ID, everything. So ID, that means the design itself. That's a tremendous amount of cost versus software, except for maybe a few licenses or whatnot. There's not much of a cost here. And so those differences are very important, because that gives a different aspects of risk, a different mindset. You can immediately see that if you ask the question about 2 years from now, one can answer, the other is sweating and doesn't even know what you're talking about. And so those things just create pretty big gaps between hardware and software. And I don't know if you've seen it before or not, but PMs are actually well positioned to bridge the gap between those two disciplines. And I think that's one of the core things you need to do as a product manager in a hardware and software company. You need to be able to bridge the gap between those two disciplines to create a much better product. So how do you do that? We're going to go through 4 basic tips for managing products that combines hardware and software. Again, there's probably many more of those, and the ones that I've chosen are pretty tactical things that you can do tomorrow. And please, if you want, you can reach out to things that are more advanced than that. So the first takeaway: given a problem, decide on the first platform to deploy the solution. When I say platform, it meaning being between hardware and software. So as an example, maybe you know that you have a connection problem, or connection is really important for your product, high speed connection. And you can decide that you're going to solve the problem with really complex and advanced software, maybe a new compression algorithm, maybe a new protocol, or you can decide that you're going to invest a lot in a hardware chip on board and shift everything to a Wi-Fi based communication that is really fast. And those are really important decisions to make. Uh, so the best way to go about this is given a problem, is think about the advantages and disadvantages of each platform. What each platform can bring to the table that is really unique and really important. Uh, After that, start with the experience that your customer needs and deserves. It actually, maybe you want to flip that often and actually start from the customer need. That is always very, very important. But it really is important to also educate yourself of the advantages of each platform, and to combine, you can take into account other factors like the release cycle and the cost. All those are really important, but come up with the best solution that utilizes each platform the best. A very important takeaway here as well is that that might change. So maybe under certain circumstances, one platform is better suited to host the solution. So let's take an example here that emphasizes that. So the smart speaker industry is really interesting, really blooming in the past years, and what all of those speaker manufacturers have done in the beginning, they took the majority of the data, and the processing of the data was done in the cloud. So maybe the person will say the whatever they want to say, the command to the smart speaker, but most of the processing will immediately be shifted to the cloud and then directed back into your device, where the device would obey your command. The reason it was chosen is because there's a lot of flexibility when you do that. That means that you have an infinite amount of processing abilities in the cloud, and you can also improve on them really fast without changing the speaker itself. And so it creates a very flexible modular solution here. And that's what everybody did in the beginning, and it worked really well. But then in the past year or two, a lot of customers started to care a lot about privacy. And they didn't necessarily like the idea of their data shifted or broadcasted to the cloud. That meant that potentially that makes them vulnerable. And so now, instead of solving the problem on the cloud, what many of those manufacturers decided to do is actually to do the processing on the smart speaker, and if anything goes to the cloud, it actually is broadcasted with an high encryption. And most of your commands are actually now with new speakers are processed on the speaker itself. What did it mean? It meant that you have to have much better hardware and processing abilities locally on your device. And that shifted the solution completely from a software-based solution to a hardware-based solution. And so that's an example for when things actually can change and the circumstances might change over time. But regardless, the same thought exercise the PMs here had to do, thinking what is the problem, and given the problem, what is the best platform to use in order to solve the problem. Okay, let's move on to takeaway number 2. So this is really important. And that's something that I think as product managers, we should be able to kind of drive. Each platform should aspire to provide the outer platform with some rigor. This is really important. In most cases, it can be, only hardware is able to practice this recommendation, because hardware has to be able to look really far out. And by the time software is able to do anything, hardware is already locked. But regardless, it might happen in different ways. So this is really important because it's the opposite of pointing fingers. And so instead of being getting to the point where uh, you would see that if you worked in those companies where you go to the hardware team and they say, well, that is a software problem. You go to the software team, that's a hardware problem. And now there's also firmware that both of them can point fingers to. But really, that the opposite of that is each platform should aspire to provide the other platform with bigger room. So the way to do that is think what challenges the other platform can run into. So an example could be maybe my product really is important. What makes it or what makes or breaks my product could be the battery or the battery performance. So you start from thinking, use the phrase of this, my product will fail if maybe so let's take the example of battery, which many consumer electronic products might fail because of battery issues. And so from a hardware perspective, you might need to think, how do I defend against that? How do I make sure that the software can operate in peak performance if needed, but doesn't completely drain the battery over time? Once challenges are identified, think what the other platform can do in order to build in wiggle room into the requirements. And that really takes a lot from a product manager here, because the product manager is best positioned to think that way. The product manager is able to understand both the constraint of the hardware and software before others can. And so you should, as a product leader, again, ingrain the thinking into this and make sure others are willing to. So let's jump into an example. This example is from our taxi services, and this has to do a lot about geography extension. So today, most of our operation is both in Mountain San Francisco, and Phoenix. From a taxiway perspective, we have other services or other presence across the state, but that is the major focus. And so if you ask our hardware team, a software team, or specifically the software team, what do they need right now, the software team will be very focused on what they have to deliver in the next week or month, because like we said, that is kind of the way their thinking is structured. And if you look at all the locations I mentioned, Mountain San Francisco, Phoenix, they are really they have great weather, from pretty much sunshine most of the year. Yes, some rain, but mostly sunshine. And so it really is different from any other place in the U.S. And so from a hardware perspective, when they don't think about only the next few months, and they actually need to think about every other place that Waymo wants to expand to, you can see that the spectrum is much larger, much wider, where the same hardware has to operate. And so from a PM's perspective, a product manager should be able to look around the corner many years from now and understand, okay, maybe right now we really care for San Francisco, maybe you really care about Phoenix, but in the future, we'll care more about expansion across the board. And so the hardware has to accommodate that. And for that reason, we built a spectacular cleaning abilities to our sensing sensors across the platform. You can see how it is also focusing both on heavy rain and snow, fog, different requirements that weren't really there when you only focus on those areas I mentioned. Great. Takeaway number 3. And this is really important, something you can do tomorrow with your team. Make sure leaders from both platforms are present in critical decision points. And so the best way to do that is actually to maybe even first designate liaisons from each of the hardware and software teams that might interact with each other at some cadence and learn about each other's needs and challenges. They also that way will build trust, and that way and that way we'll be able to talk about each other's challenges more openly. Those liaisons and leaders should be present in key decision points. So there are going to be very important decision points. The hardware team usually has those decision points ahead of the software team, and so it's really important the software leaders will be there and will be able to help each other understand the trade-offs and risks at play, and then they'll be able to plan their development accordingly. So if I'm a software leader and I understand there's a certain hardware problem, I can already think ahead of it and start experimenting and developing solutions that go around that problem. And that also helps earn trust, build ownership. Now I understand what is happening, and as a software leader, can take ownership and drive through a solution across the board. Yeah. So let's take an example from the trucking side of our business at Waymo. We were really debating in the tracking side of the business whether to place sensors on the tractor. And so the truck, for those who don't know, comes in two pieces. Actually, there's a trailer and there's a tractor. The tractor is attached to the trailer, and we had to make a decision whether we place sensors across those two components, two parts of the vehicle, if you will. From a hardware perspective, it would be really, really difficult, and they just couldn't find easy ways to do that. Uh, Mostly because of the nature of the trailer and how large that is, and what would that mean for the system. And so we had a decision here with the software leaders in the same room, making that decision that we will not have sensing abilities on the tractor. That meant that the software team needed to step up and say, yeah, we'll be able to solve those problems via software without the hardware support. And we'll have to experiment and think ahead of time how we will do that. And that could have been only taken place with those leaders in the same room. Otherwise, it would never have been such an easy or such a fruitful conversation in a way that can actually set up our team for success. Great. Let's talk about the fourth and last takeaway. Test often and test efficiently. So this is very easy or intuitive to do when you have software. Like I said, the release cadence is really fast, and there's so many frameworks today that are available for product managers to think how they should test their software really early. Guess what? The same thing, same reason for testing early software applies with testing hardware. And more importantly, when you have to test both, it's really important to align between them. And so you need to create a plan that maximizes the value from each one of those platforms. Because by the time you want to create a prototype, a hardware prototype, in order to evaluate the product and evaluate whether the customer likes the product, you also want to make sure that there's a software there that is compatible enough and working as planned in order to actually test what you had in mind. And so it's really important for you as a product manager to align and make sure that you can run the test you want and get the customer feedback you want. And that's really one of the key points as a product manager to doing it. Often, you also need to think about ways to test the software before the hardware is ready. So there's gonna be some issues there because the software has to be tested. There are some ways to test software without hardware via simulation, but always the best way to do that is also to have certain pieces of hardware. So as a product manager, you also have to think from that other side of saying, okay, we want to test with the customer, but we also want to test to have the software team enough tools in order to test their software. How can I work with the hardware team in order to enable that and provide the tools that the software team needs to test their software? So again, testing often, testing efficiently really is the best way for you to get the customer feedback you need to know that you're building the right product. You have to create alignment on the testing cycle between hardware and software to do so. And often it also means you have to think about ways to provide the software team ways to test their software early. Again, a great example from our taxi side of the business. And so the Waymo vehicles at first it's an interesting story. Were just vehicles that were bought off the lot. So back then, Waymo was part of Google, the Moonshine Factory, and folks didn't even know if it's a worthwhile endeavor, if people would be even interested. So before investing a lot of money and time into this, they just bought off the lot multiple cars and installed the first suite of sensors on them. After that initial test, uh, things got more progressed. There was a bit of a more collaboration with the car manufacturers, but really the company wasn't sure yet what is the right format here, what kind of car people would like to think of. Maybe we need to reimagine the vehicle and car as it is today. And that really drove us to think about different prototypes in different ways. And you can start seeing maybe Waymo and Google at this point thought to create their own internal car to imagine the future of autonomous vehicles. And there was an interesting set of prototypes that you can see in front of you until for the first time, Waymo created its own car. We call it the Firefly. And that was the first AV car as we know it that actually drove autonomously with nobody behind the vehicle, behind the wheel. There was actually no wheel. And one of the interesting learnings here from a customer perspective was that customers were very anxious when there was no wheel, even though they didn't or in today's cars, today's driverless service we provide in Phoenix, they obviously are not supposed or allowed to touch the wheel. Having a wheel there is tremendously relaxing for them. So that was an interesting learning. Many other learnings that the company had with this initial prototype of a car that shifted the thinking all across. And this is just to say, over a span of several years, Waymo was able to produce so many prototypes in order to get initial or early customer feedback and line up on what we have today in our fleet. So this is to just wrap up everything. There are four main takeaways. So the first one was, given a problem, decide on the best platform to deploy the solution on, be it software or the hardware platform that you have. Each one of those platform, hardware or software, should aspire and to provide the other platform with some wiggle room or as much wiggle room as possible. Make sure that leaders from both platforms are present in critical decision points. And this is really your opportunity as a product manager to make sure that those two disciplines are talking on a very uh, certain cadence that allows them to gain trust, understand each other's challenges, and be able to make those decisions. And lastly, test often, test efficiently in order to get the right feedback, both from each platform, but most importantly, from your customers. So thank you so much for joining my talk today. Please reach out offline. Like I said, I'm really passionate about this topic, and I'm super excited to hear what everybody else's experience was, and share thoughts. Yeah, hopefully you find this helpful, and thank you so much.